Hello, everybody. So welcome to this evening's event. If you've not been to one of our events before, just to say that Shelley and I are the co-founders and co-conveners of the BAFTSS Horror Studies SIG. And among various other things, we run these monthly events on various horror topics. And we've got a really good one for you tonight. What about the men, masculinity and horror? We're really excited for this one, and there's a great panel, but I'm going to let our chair introduce them. So without further ado, our chair is Rebecca McCallum. Rebecca, are you with us? Hi.
Hi.
Hi. So, Rebecca is a writer, speaker, and she's also the creator and host of Talking Hitchcock, which is a podcast that explores the work and the world of her favorite director. The podcast covers deep dives on Hitchcock's films, as well as topic-driven discussions on everything in the Hitchcockian universe. She curates, hosts, and speaks at Hitchcock screenings and festivals around the UK, and she's written about Hitchcock and his films, both online and in print, for lots of publications, including Fangoria, Grim Journal, Hemlock Books, and Movie Jawn. She has presented at HitchCon, which is the largest international Hitchcock conference of its kind, and also co-hosted a Hitchcock program on BBC Radio. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Rebecca and yeah, enjoy the event, everybody.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you and welcome to everyone who's joining us for this evening's panel, which I'm delighted to be chairing. And joining me are four truly fantastic horror academics who I know are so passionate about the genre and have lots to share. I don't know about you, but I cannot wait to listen to our speakers. But just to give you a quick overview of how the panel's going to work, I'll begin by asking the speakers to introduce themselves. I'll then invite each panelist to share their explorations through their short presentations. And after each presentation concludes, I'll give each speaker a quick opportunity to make a few post-talk comments with a quick question or two. And once all of the panelists have spoken, we'll then open up the floor for the Q&A segment and do our absolute best in the time that we've got to answer as many of your questions as possible. So let's waste no more time and begin with those introductions. And let's start with Amy.
Good evening. Thanks so much, Rebecca. Thank you, Laura, as well. Hi, yes, I'm Amy Beddows. I'm a horror scholar, but I'm also a trauma therapist. So I'm coming at this from a bit of a dual perspective. And I might actually just dive in and hit my bit of the presentation. So there we go. So I'm going to talk specifically about masculinity as identity, and I'm going to try and keep this to a tight 10 minutes, so please bear with me. But working in mental health and particularly with trauma therapy, there's a lot of conversations about whether or not at the moment there's a bit of a crisis for young men in terms of identity, masculinity. You know, we have conversations quite a lot, both within our team and with clients, around the impact of sort of influencers, people like Andrew Tate and these kind of very big voices about what it means to be a man and how young men relate to or not those kind of voices. Things like the manosphere, we've got incel culture, pornography use, particularly violent pornography. There's a lot of talk about this kind of crisis of what it means to be a man. But from a healthcare perspective, we're also aware this has been called a loneliness epidemic, that actually a lot of this sort of uncertainty around identity for young men has really significant health impacts. And we're seeing that in terms of mental health, physical health, just general well-being. Now, a really interesting book, if you're curious about this topic, is by Jackson Katz. He wrote on this, he calls it the macho paradox, this sort of conflict that a lot of men face about, is masculinity necessarily synonymous with violence and aggression? And of course, a lot of these conversations can't just be about gender. They are intersected with race and ethnicity, sexuality, age, and class. They're really complex, nuanced conversations around identity. And whereas some people use the concept of toxic masculinity to talk about harmful or damaging kind of forms of masculinity, this is problematic because it really individualizes this problem with individuals. It's also become quite a racialized class term. When we talk about toxic masculinity in public or more academic spheres, we're often referring to, for example, young Black men in gangs in London, and we're not talking about older white men in the White House. Just a random example off the top of my head. So why does this matter? Why are we talking about this in terms of horror? And media more wildly, there's a lot of conversations around male role models for young men particularly. And my colleague and good friend Nikki Uru, he speaks about this constant binary there seems to be when we talk about what role model and representations actually look like. They're either good or bad, toxic or progressive. There's very little in between, and there's very little nuance. I'm quite interested that over the last sort of 20 or so years, we've had this massive influx of superhero movies and superhero culture, which is really related to this kind of hard body physicality that seems quite dominant messaging to men about how they should look. And again, particularly young men. To come specifically to horror, Carol Clover's spoken about how the male archetype of violence is really embedded in horror film. And this probably won't be particularly new to any of you horror fans or horror academics, that villains and antagonists are typically male coded, if they're not outwardly male, as aggressive and violent and sort of unemotional rationality versus the female victim emotionality, weakness, and passivity that they're contrasted to. But a lot of these conversations around representation, around role models, around toxic versus positive, it kind of treats men as a homogenous group, and it doesn't sort of recognize that men are individuals and are very critical consumers of media and representation. So I think these conversations need to kind of move beyond these binaries and this good, bad, toxic, progressive narrative. Thankfully, I think horror film is a wonderful medium that can really help us with that. And this is something that has come into the therapy work I've done with some clients. Particularly modern horror films, I believe, are starting to show us much more varied, diverse, nuanced representations of men and masculinity. From Randolph speaking about the kind of typical hypermasculine, hypersexual, or hyperaggressive representations of Black men in film. Sort of recent, very successful, high-profile films have given us Black male protagonists who are loving and gentle and caring, but also autonomous and have agency and save the day. Thinking of Nope or Us or Get Out, but also films like Werewolves Within. So that's been a wonderful kind of challenge to a lot of the kind of traditional representation in terms of race and ethnicity. And then touching briefly on fatherhood, which can be an aspect of men's identity, I pulled out just two Southeast Asian films, which I thought were really interesting in that. You've got Train to Busan, which deals with a couple of male characters who are also fathers and are sort of battling between self-preservation, protecting their children and their families, but also the conflict between being a career man and being a good partner and being a father and being an individual. So these kind of interesting tensions on the sort of micro and macro level, whilst also dealing with a very real survival horror threat. And then an interesting film, a Taiwanese film called Incantation, added another layer to this, where there's a lot of, fathers in horror is not an unusual trope, and my colleague Kai could speak to that much more if people are interested in that. But actually, there's this curious tension between biological versus non-biological fathers, and Incantation really kind of plays with that, because the male main character, Ming, is protecting a young girl who isn't his child. He was briefly a foster carer to her, but he makes the very clear statement of actually, it doesn't matter whether I'm her biological dad or not, I'm her father and I'm going to protect her. And again, that's something that I don't feel we typically see in any media, let alone horror media. And another aspect of this that I think is really important is that trans men and trans young men and boys get to exist. So for Evil Dead Rise, there was a trans male character who's played by a trans man actor, and his trans identity was not part of the plot and it was not part of the threat. He just was. He just got to exist with his identity as he was in that film. And I think that's such important representation. It doesn't always have to be big and bombastic and part of the film. It can be you're just on screen and you get to be your authentic self. So before I wrap up, I wanted to talk about two key points of this masculinity as identity and representation that I am particularly passionate about. And one is men's mental health, and one is male survivors of abuse and trauma. And a couple of films that came out within the last 10 years, I think, have really give us a much more nuanced explorations, if you like, of men's loneliness, men's mental health. Films like They Look Like People, which is a wonderful film I'll never stop raving about, and I hope everyone gets to see it, really tackles this face on with the two male protagonists who are really struggling with what it means to be a man in the real world, in terms of in employment, in romantic relationships, in friendship, whilst also dealing with this very terrifying sort of supernatural threat that they're facing, and how they manage their emotions and compassion and their vulnerability with each other. They're very close friends, whilst also retaining that very typical male kind of stoic assertiveness, aggression, while facing the threat. And I think the film speaks very clearly to that in the final scenes. I won't spoil it, but there is a juxtaposition between intense, terrifying violence and incredible emotional intimacy between the two characters, which is beautiful, and I think is not something we typically see on screen. And then something like the much more jaunty escape room, where a group of survivors are kind of plonked together in a kind of deadly game scenario. And a couple of the male characters are really interesting in the different versions of masculinity they represent. You've got someone who's really struggling with grief and trauma, who's not really finding employment, is struggling with addiction. And then you've got a very highfalutin, ruthless finance guy with suits and cars and money and status. And the sort of the way the two of them tussle whilst trying to survive the kind of external threat. And it poses these questions about actually, should this be about mercy and vulnerability versus ruthlessness and aggression, teamwork versus individualism? And it's fascinating because, again, I think the film makes a clear statement depending on who survives and who doesn't. And then a more recent film, which again, hasn't seemed to have got much kind of critical analysis, Mother May I, really explores men's emotions and the validity of men's emotions. And it sort of touches on this idea that typically in film, and particularly in film where there's like a threat or a stress or a trauma, men only really get to be angry. And that anger is often synonymous with aggression and is seen as a bad thing. Whereas actually men's entitlement to grief, sadness, loss, confusion, all the gamut of emotions is just as valid, but also sometimes men's anger can be weaponized against them. And that's something I talk to so much in therapy with young men, is anger is not synonymous with aggression. One is healthy, one is not. And actually often in film, again, those two things are not necessarily pulled apart or explored in the way that is helpful for people who are viewing it. Again, I work with quite a lot of victims and survivors of abuse. And these sort of more recent films, I think, are wonderful because they really do complicate this kind of dominant myth that we see in society as well as film, this idea of the cycle of abuse, that if as a man you experience abuse or really intense trauma or loss, you will grow up to become an abuser. And we can see that in the kind of origin story or evolution of so many classic horror film baddies. Interestingly, though, when you look at some of the final girl tropes, it feels like women get to have abuse or trauma and loss, and that becomes part of their resilience and their strength and their resourcefulness in fighting off the abusers. But male characters don't seem to be allowed that. And these films really challenge that. So Possum is a fantastic film that touches on the long-term, very damaging experiences of abuse, but also allows the survivor to be the hero and to kind of have the agency and the hopefulness that is often not allowed to characters who've been through experiences like he has. A film called The Passenger, which again, I've not seen huge numbers of people talking about. The two male leads kind of go on this joyride together in terms of making sense of their own personal grief and trauma and loss. One of them does it in an incredibly angry, violent, and vengeful way. One of them is much more quiet and introverted and looking with making amends and healing. And again, the film sets up this fascinating juxtaposition about which approach actually serves us and which makes things much harder for us and those around us. And then even in a film like Nope, which deals with grief and loss, Otis Jr. is kind of struggling with the death of his father while trying to protect himself, his family, his ranch, his legacy, from a very scary alien supernatural threat. And rather than use violence and aggression and big bombastic kind of action, he uses strategy, and he's very thoughtful and very kind of contemplative about his response. And that's what works for him. And that's what works to keep the kind of narrative going and protect the people he cares for. So this really speaks to a concept coined by Cornel West, this idea, again, it's a bit of a binary, but I think it's an interesting one, that if we, particularly men, have experienced some kind of trauma or hurt, you either get to be a wounded hurter and kind of perpetuate that, or you get to be a wounded healer, you get to challenge that, you get to help yourself and others, and you get to grow and move forward. And I think it's really exciting that in modern horror, we're seeing more wounded healers and fewer wounded hurters. And I think for men who are looking for identity and to make sense of their experiences, that is a brilliant thing. Thank you so much for your time. I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to take a breath, and I'm going to hand over to my colleague, John, when he is ready. Thank you.
Okay, I'm John Kavanagh, and I got my PhD a few years ago, where I looked at the slasher film, the structures of the slasher film, the identities that are found within, and the key components and stuff like that. Recently found out I'm employable. Just got a job there as an associate researcher and outreach officer for the creative industries in my local area. But on that note, I'm just going to get on with the presentation. Since its inception in 1974, the slasher film has been analysed in many ways, and a wide variety of methodologies have been applied to the subgenre. Despite this, it quickly becomes clear that the masculinities found in these texts are under-examined and need to be explored further. During my PhD research, I discovered that the key components of the franchise slasher film, the killer, the victim, and the survivor, needed to be re-examined regarding their identities, the relationships between each component, and the roles within each text. Whilst the survivor is usually, but not always, a feminine presenting figure, the other two key components provide us with many masculine figures to examine, and this brief presentation will focus on potential ideas on how to understand the masculine identities of the slasher subgenre. When researching the slasher subgenre, there are key texts that will be encountered early in the process. The most influential and well-known of these is Clover's Men, Women and Chainsaws, first published in 1992. This text saw such success that it appears to have directly influenced the direction of the subgenre from the self-reflexive cycle of the mid-90s onwards. Modern readers will understand that it produces a reductive reading of gendered identities in the slasher film by creating a binary of masculine violence and feminine victimhood. The killers are framed as masculine due to their use of violence, the victims are framed as feminine as they receive violent acts, and the survivors become hybridized due to their initial victimization and their latter self-defense. Watching slasher films does not produce an understanding that reflects this binary, as the interactions between each key component is much more nuanced than the late 20th century readings suggest. There have been many readings of the slasher subgenre since that either challenge or reinforce this reading, but this denial of masculine victimhood is rarely addressed, and the individual identities of the killers are usually ignored in favour of a more general reading of this component. Before going any further, it's important to note that masculinity itself doesn't really exist. Instead, it's more apt to use the term masculinities, plural. There is no singular masculinity that can be applied to all men everywhere. The formation of a gendered identity relies on the influences of the surrounding culture, the environment the figure has been raised in, and the ongoing social interactions found in locations such as schoolhouses, recreational spaces, and workplaces. This could lead to as many gendered identities as there are people. We'd be here all day if I was to examine every form of masculine identity found in the slasher film, but luckily cultural texts tend to provide a shorthand version in the form of archetypes. When examining the victims of the slasher film, particularly the characters found in the young communities of the franchise slasher film, three dominant archetypes emerge in most texts: the would-be hero, the lovable or lonely loser, and the hypermasculine. Whilst these three masculine identities do not cover the entire scope of masculine victimhood in the slasher film, they are the most commonly recurring identities and cover a large quantity of masculine victims across the subgenre. The would-be hero is a fascinating figure that would have a much different fate if they appeared in the classical or post-Fortean cycles of the horror genre. When we think of the classical hero, they're usually figures that derive their power from religious faith, scientific principles, or their beliefs in their own abilities and convictions. For the post-Fortean hero, we typically associate them with strong convictions relating to normality and its enforcers, usually leading to the army or the police resolving the major conflicts of the text. These concepts lead to either the hero or normality prevailing, and the monstrous entity being destroyed or forced to retreat. In the postmodern horror, this concept shifts, and such convictions or belief inevitably leads towards victimization. In the slasher film, these figures are often positioned as the partner or love interest of the survivor, or in some notable instances, they can play a more fatherly role, such as Dr. Loomis of the Halloween franchise. The narratives imply that the would-be hero is the last line of defense against the killer, and rather than resolving the conflict, as he would in the past, he worsens it, as his death, or removal from the plot, typically destroys all hope in defeating the killer and allowing normality to return. Instead, the survivor is forced into a prolonged cat-and-mouse chase and later a climactic conflict with the killer that destroys their understanding of the world around them, revealing a new and much more dangerous reality than the normality that they've become accustomed to. When we look at the would-be heroes of the Friday the 13th franchise, for example, we typically find characters that are suited to the recreational wilderness of Crystal Lake. Survivalists, seasoned campers or counsellors, and men that work on the land whose deaths were either be obscured by the camera or take place off-screen entirely. This occurs until Tommy Jarvis merges the roles of the would-be hero and the survivor in the 6th entry of the franchise. After this point, the would-be hero shifts to a figure that is shown to be less capable in the wilderness than the feminine survivor who is forced from the plot prior to the climactic confrontation by being knocked out by the killer, only to return when the survivor has already prevailed. The Halloween franchise takes a different approach to the would-be hero, as this role is often resolved for Dr. Loomis, the killer's primary caregiver. Despite Loomis appearing or having a presence in each entry of the franchise except for 3 films, he is victimized in each entry outside of the original. The killer utilizes violence against him and either kills Loomis, incapacitates him, or leads him to take his own life in the hope of destroying his patient. His role as a would-be hero does not focus on his potential death, instead on his failures as a doctor, a hero, and a man. His role is to fail, allow his patient to roam the environment freely, and leave the survivor isolated to deal with his patient. There are other characters throughout the franchise that also function as would-be heroes, but they tend to have a lesser role than Dr. Loomis, and these figures are killed prior to the Doctor being incapacitated. The most notable of these secondary would-be heroes is Brady of Halloween 4. The lonely or lovable loser exists to emphasize the potential of the would-be hero and to present them as a more normative masculine figure that could enable the return to normality. Whilst the loser part of their title might sound a bit judgmental, it works to emphasize their slightly lower social position as either inspiration for pathos or comedic relief when compared to their heroic or hyper-masculine counterparts. The lonely loser is often framed as a less socially capable figure, or sometimes a pathetic figure, that is rejected by their love interest and killed after a moment of pathos. The lovable loser appears to be better adjusted than their lonely counterparts, as they are in loving relationships and they are often victimized prior to or alongside their partners in close proximity to a sexual encounter. Each text will typically use one of these figures, and each franchise will usually favour one over the other. Friday the 13th focuses on the lonely loser with characters like Shelley in Part 3, or Eddie in The New Blood. Halloween focuses on the lovable loser with characters like Spitz in The Revenge of Michael Myers, or Charlie in H2O. Their deaths usually occur towards the middle of the text as the environmental collapse begins to take shape. The hypermasculine is presented as an aggressive character that could potentially be a threat to the cast if a killer wasn't stalking the environment. These characters either use or imply the threat of force or have a position that implies their physical capabilities. But little ever comes of it, as the killer victimizes them prior to them being able to live up to their reputations or social standing. Sometimes these characters act as a foil to the would-be hero, or they may intimidate the loser, but just as often, they're key members of the young community. Their physical capabilities are undermined entirely, as their strength is useless against the killer. Notable examples of this include Julius's rooftop boxing match in Jason Takes Manhattan, Mike's macho posturing in The Revenge of Michael Myers, or Rod Lane, the implied criminal, being hanged by Freddy in A Nightmare on Elm Street. Just as the loser exists to emphasize the potential of the would-be hero, the hypermasculine figure exists to heighten the threat of the killer. So, you might be wondering, why should we examine these masculine identities in the slasher film? Well, most readings of the slasher usually favours analysis of the killer and the survivor, but leave the victims underexplored as almost like a blob of set pieces that separate the introduction of the killer and the climactic confrontation at the end. It is clear when watching these films that the victims have interesting identities that help to shape the environments that will be collapsed by the killer. It's also clear that there are a large quantity of masculine characters that are victimized in these texts, as shown by the results of a content analysis that you're seeing on screen. Apologies about the pile of data here, which won't be on screen long. But this is results from a content analysis of 3 key and long-running slasher franchises. Whilst this graph shows that there are overall twice as many masculine victims as feminine victims, it also shows that this is not reflected in the overall screen time of these death sequences. There is a disparity that has been addressed in other analysis, but masculine victimization still takes up a significant amount of the runtime of these franchises. A montage of masculine victimization in the Friday the 13th franchise could almost make up an individual film, as we can see from the first set of data there. Further research needs to be done to fill the gaps of masculine victimization, and we're running out of time in this, what was supposed to be a brief presentation. Finally, I'd like to very quickly address the identity of the killer. Usually, The killer is presented as a masculine figure due to their aesthetic qualities. It's hard to look at their costuming and weaponry that provide working class or racialized signifiers and not connect them to existing masculine identities. But looking beyond that, we have to question whether they have identities at all, or whether instead they convey the cultural context of each film or franchise. To have a gendered identity or any identity at all, you have to be socialized. The killers of the slasher subgenre are almost always denied this, and if they're not, it's at least heavily restricted. Michael is sequestered in Smith's Grove, an institution that those that deviate from the white picket fence style normality of late 20th century suburbia are placed to not infect the rest of the population. And he's also deemed as evil quite consistently. We hear it a lot in each of the films by his only connection to the world. Jason is secluded in the last remaining elements of the untamed land of the original 13 colonies of the United States. This is an area missed during the process of colonization, ethnic cleansing, and later, not a real word, but stick with me, recreationalization of rurality, due to his perceived drowning and his mother's revenge, which pretty much closes off the area. Freddy is abandoned entirely due to his position as the bastard son of 100 maniacs, an abject entity that is ostracized by the world around him until his crimes attract the attention of an extrajudicial mob. None of these killers are socialized in a traditional way, leading to Freddy's abject existence and lingering impression on the parents and children of the Spring World environment. And the blank slates of Michael and Jason, they were isolated entirely and removed from any form of socialization or society. This makes them, their lack of gender, identity, and socialization, qualities that have led to them becoming understood as blank slates, makes them perfectly suited to become vehicles for their cultural context of their respective franchises. I would love to go into more detail, but I'll stop bothering you at this point. Thanks for listening, folks.
Thanks so much, John, especially for talking about one of my favourite subgenres, the slasher, and you've provided such refreshing insights alongside bar charts and data, which never apologise for because my brain absolutely loves that. So next, I would like to welcome Lakaya to introduce herself and share her presentation on race and masculinity in American horror cinema. Take it away, Lakaya.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you, Amy and John, for such incredible presentations. Hi, I'm Lakaya. I'm a filmmaker, and I've just recently passed my Viva with minor corrections at University College London. And with that, I will share my screen. Great. So today, we will be looking at the cannibalization of the Black body, or more specifically, the Black male body in horror cinema, by looking at a few case studies throughout the 20th and 21st century. So starting off with D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, which was released in 1915. It portrayed Black men, or white actors with blackface, as sexually aggressive towards white women, and the KKK being positioned as heroes. Film historians such as Landry and Griffith said that the film combined the twin nightmares of folklore in America, rape and race. Black masculinity then was seen as primitive and often cannibalized by white men in power. And then we move on to the 30s and 50s, where the presence of Black people in horror films was minimal, and representations can be argued to be horrific. Many Black actors only portrayed the roles of servants, tribesmen, and comedic buffoons, as film critic and creator of Black horror movies, Mark Harris, puts it. Likewise, sometimes Black men were racially coded characters, usually as animals or other non-human characters. Primarily, there was the connotation of the Black man being associated with a monkey or gorilla, as we see through the examples of King Kong. This was used to dehumanize and humiliate Black men, as to heighten their perceived savagery and lack of intelligence. So-called researchers such as Plowson and Williams found that people often thought of Black men as mentally inferior, physically and culturally unevolved, and ape-like in appearance. This belief was reinforced by national heroes such as Theodore Roosevelt, who publicly stated that as a race and in the mass, the Negroes are altogether inferior to whites. So although the Black male body was not consumed in a physical sense, you could argue that there was almost a symbolic consumption of their humanity through the representation of them as animals. And then we move on to the 1960s with the release of George A. Romero's Night of the Living Dead, which signaled a monumental change for Black male representation within horror film. Dwayne Jones became the first Black protagonist in a horror film as he played the character Ben. The film received praise for its portrayal of heroic Black protagonists and reflecting the social turmoil of the civil rights movements and violent assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. Whilst this was revolutionary for Black representation or Black male representation, how revolutionary was it, seeing as Ben, the heroic protagonist, is shot dead at the film's end by a group of white men that eerily resemble the Klansmen? In some ways, then, he also becomes symbolically cannibalized by white men in power. Then moving on to the 1980s, we get this kind of notion of Black people die first in horror trope. We can see examples of this from The Shining, which shows Jack Torrance killing Dick Halloran, the Overlook Hotel chef. And then in 1992, we get Candyman, a really key film of the decade that depicts a Black man who was lynched, re-emerging to wreak havoc and terrorize anyone who dares to say his name. However, again, how much progress did horror actually make with this portrayal? He does not die in the same way that Ben from Night of the Living Dead does, but he's still portrayed as extremely violent, and his quote-unquote ghetto neighborhood is only saved by arguably the protagonist Helen, who is a white woman. So then we move on to the 2000s to 2010s, where there was a slight rise in positive representations of Blackness in film, yet no film became as significant as Jordan Peele's Get Out. The film garnered praise because of its themes of race in a time that became centered around Black Lives Matter protests after the death of George Floyd. There is somewhat a cannibalization of Black men in American society at the time, as there is within horror cinema, which I've always found interesting. The Black body in American horror cinema becomes a spectacle then, in many ways, one which is treated as a site of consumption for typically a white symbolic cannibal who seeks to consume the Black body for their own benefit. For example, in Get Out, the symbolic cannibal is revealed to be Dean Armitage, along with his wife and 2 children, who kidnap and steal Black individuals, primarily Black men, actually, and implant their bodies with white consciousness. However, it's not just the Armitage family who engage in this, but a wider network of primarily upper-class white individuals, with some exceptions. In the film, the symbolic cannibals are metaphorically consuming the Black bodies as they desire the vessel of the Black body, but still believe in the superiority of white consciousness. I believe this has ties to older films such as Wes Craven's The Hills of Eyes in 1977, with the Carter family symbolically consuming, economically speaking, at the expense of the racially coded hill-dwelling family, who themselves are then coded as the literal cannibals. So I find that dichotomy quite interesting. The white patriarch of Get Out exhibits similar greed and consumption habits as he seeks to profit and benefit from those who are marginalized. The tradition of the Black body being a site of literal and metaphorical cannibalism then also ties back to a film that I previously discussed with Night of the Living Dead. While the heroic Black protagonist Ben survives the zombie threat, as I mentioned, he's shot dead at the end and symbolically consumed by the white men in power. Whereas Dean from Get Out is a figure who consumes and profits from these marginalized people. In this case, in the case of Get Out, auctioning off their bodies. Yet his authority is challenged by the marginalized Chris, and he engages in violence against his Black victims. However, unlike the long-standing horror tradition of the Black character being murdered, the Armitages fail to murder Chris, who escapes and reigns somewhat victorious at the film's end. They fail partly because Chris uses tools that would have otherwise rendered him powerless in society, such as picking cotton from the chairs that he was chained to block out the sound of Missy's hypnosis with a teacup, to aid his escape and eradicate the Armitage family. By allowing Chris, as a Black man, to survive, Peele empowers the character who otherwise would have been powerless in the face of persecution. A similar tool is used in Jewel Taylor's They Cloned Tyrone, which has nods to the Blaxploitation era of the 70s, as the film transforms the stereotypical Black archetypes of the drug dealer with Fontaine, the pimp with Slick Charles, into being heroes. They can free themselves and empower themselves against an oppressive government who are cloning and controlling Black communities, but again, primarily Black men. This connects directly to the legacy of Peele, showcasing Black anxieties about white exploitation. Even though Fontaine is positioned as a violent drug dealer, he's still extremely intelligent. He's a catalyst for Black victory towards the end of the film, despite the fact that he still has to live with the reality that he is a clone. Sorry for the spoilers, but you know, the name is They Cloned Tyrone. So I guess in conclusion, New Wave Black films such as Get Out or They Cloned Tyrone illustrate that the Black bodies are in revolt against this kind of metaphorical cannibalism and traditionalist structures, oppression and degradation that they represent. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation, and I will stop sharing now.
Kaya, that was absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much for that remarkable presentation. And for the final talk of the evening, we are careering ahead. The time's going nowhere. I'd love to welcome Andrea, who is going to be presenting on coerced reproduction and angry white men and fetishizing the male body. Thank you, Andrea.
Hi, everybody. It's good to be here and to see everybody. I'm going to be talking a little bit about my research, which focuses on coerced reproduction in horror film. So for those I've not presented to before, my main area of research is coerced reproduction in horror film, and I'm basically attempting to make the case that this is an overlooked subgenre which needs acknowledging, and for this purpose, I've devised a method for analysing coerced reproduction as a three-stage process rather than an act of physical violence. Whilst the focus of my thesis is how coerced reproduction works as a process in horror screen text, it relates to the study of masculinities and masculine identity in horror by considering them as a significant driver of that process. And whilst coerced reproduction is identifiable in many different horror texts and in many different guises, I've limited my research from 1968 to 2022, as these dates correspond with two key dates in women's reproductive rights calendar, as well as seminal points in horror screen text development. Also, I just don't have the word count to include everything. 1968 saw the release of Rosemary's Baby, widely considered the first modern horror film. It was also the year that saw the establishment of the female contraceptive pill, which became accessible to a mass market to the objection of numerous religious and political social groups. In 2022, the US Supreme Court overturned the Roe versus Wade, removing the right of women to seek an abortion on medical grounds. Underpinning this research and the inspiration for it was the release of The Handmaid's Tale TV series in 2016, which coincided with the election of Donald Trump for the first time. A well-known pro-natalist whose first administration decimated reproductive care for women both in the United States and overseas. The 4 films, Rosemary's Baby, Demon Seed, Don't Breathe, Midsummer, are the films that I am included in my thesis as case studies to demonstrate the validity of a reproductive subgenre. So tonight I'm just going to give an overview of some of the concepts I'm researching at this particular moment in time. I'm still in the process of writing up my thesis, and that is looking at the woman's body in horror as a scene of crime, as well as a scene of horror, and angry white men theory. This research does hinge on the female reproductive system, who gets control of it, and the right of access to it. Annette Colony once wrote of the female body as a fought over territory and landscape men sought to possess and control through a variety of methods, including through pregnancy. The depiction of the female body as a male possession is a noted trope in horror fiction, but with this research, I'm looking at how this possession happens and the presentation through the horror narrative of how this possession becomes justifiable on some level. So, for example, in The Handmaid's Tale, it is justified by stating a need to increase the population, so reproduction for a greater purpose. And this is why I'm theorising that in reproductive horror, the woman's body should be considered as a site of crime, because this is often against her will and the place where horror is performed. Another key trope that has become a keystone of my research is that of angry white men. The emergence of the angry white man comes through sociologist Michael Kimmel, who first wrote of this theory in his now seminal text of the same name in 2013 and again in 2017, following the first election of Trump to the American presidency. Kimmel considers the angry white man to be a social movement emerging following the Clinton although that's another topic, Clinton presidency, when a number of legislative initiatives designed to generate equality in society resulted in a loss of status for others in American heartlands, creating a new category of the disenfranchised. Kimmel suggested that you could identify angry white men through a sense of aggrieved entitlement. This is the main driving force behind the mobilisation of the angry white men movement, and refers to that feeling of not getting something they believed they were entitled to, or a service that they believed they were entitled to access. Not what they have earned or worked to achieve, but something that they should just receive or get preferential access to. Kimmel situates this element as an emotive reaction that leads to a sense of victimhood. Kimmel states that those who fall into the angry white man category lack the capacity or are reluctant to take ownership of problems that could be interpreted as a personal failure, and follows the perception of being denied access to the thing or service they believe they were entitled to. To this latter definition, I add for my own research that the sense of denial comes with a proxy, a figure or representative that the angry white man can project their sense of anger or denial onto, to use as a scapegoat to remove any sense of personal responsibility. Kimmel stresses that the angry white man movement, is to do with privilege and expectation rather than race and gender. In terms of this research and of coerced reproduction in wider social and political spheres, the angry white man plays a pivotal role, not just in terms of actual impregnation. The concept of entitlement is one that factors significantly in my research. So, for example, in Rosemary's Baby, the character Guy felt entitled to allow a satanic cult to use his wife's body for reproductive purposes. However, more recently, an interesting idea came to the fore, which is what happens when the stereotypical gender-specific roles are flipped. So on this slide, you can see a picture of Christian Hughes, the character from Midsummer, who may seem like a strange choice to have in this presentation, but please bear with me. Christian, for me, is a great advocate for the concept of a coerced reproductive subgenre, because he embodies all roles, as well as challenging long-held character archetypes. At the start of the film, Christian appears to be a regular, heteronormative character who will either become a hero or a villain type, when in fact he's more. He ends the film occupying the feminized position of the coerced subject. Christian becomes feminized and fetishized through his coerced coupling with the young Haga girl, Maya, for the express purpose of impregnating her. But Christian as a biological male cannot become pregnant, but it is his body that becomes a violated entity for the purpose of reproduction in this instance. During the insemination scene, the viewer witnesses Christian acting in a passive manner. He is drugged and disrobed and is required to have intercourse with Maya in front of a chanting group of female Hag elders. And this scene is reminiscent of the ritual impregnation scene from Rosemary's Baby. However, after the coupling, the viewer sees a naked Christian fleeing from the hut in terror, clearly traumatized by the experience. I've incorporated several theoretical perspectives in my framework, but for those on screen are the cornerstones of this research project. Mulvey's male gaze uses psychoanalytical approach to highlight how the gaze of the camera is considered by default male-centric in its placement of the female protagonist. By this placement becomes objectified and passive, fetishized and sexualized, all terms that can be described Christian at the ending of the film. Carol Clover incorporates Mulvey's notion of the male gaze as the basis for her theory of the assaultive reactive gaze. Clover's theory argues that the assaultive gaze is usually male and the reactive gaze female, akin to the gendered active-passive roles respectively. Clover also suggests that anyone on the receiving end of the assaultive gaze is feminized as a result, regardless of biological gender, and that the use and positionality of the camera incorporates these notions of the gaze to portray a gendered understanding to the viewer. The character of Christian is displaced from the expected norm of a heterosexual lead male protagonist, that or hero or slayer or villain. He is the coerced subject and therefore feminized by default. The prospect of Christian as a victim from the perspective of the female reactive gaze and male assaultive gaze demonstrates that the use of Clover's theory offers an interesting challenge to the perspective of masculinities in horror, specifically regarding the body in horror narratives, because the expectant trajectory of the stereotypical male character is disrupted. So just to wrap up, why does this matter now? Writer Tyler Unsell identifies coerced reproduction as an existential threat that has manifested in current-day horror fiction, demonstrating this theme has come to the attention of screen analysts via modern-day socio-political cultural events. The headlines you're seeing on screen are no more than a few years old and just a small example of what I've found since starting this project. There is a notable change in discussion surrounding reproductive autonomy and drives to increase reproduction in America and beyond. These discussions are increasing in tempo and scope and in some respects can no longer be considered as simply discussions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrea, for sharing that fascinating overview of your really crucial research concepts with us. That was fantastic. And so that concludes the presentations for this evening. Thank you so much to Amy, to John, to Kaya and Andrea. That was, I'm sure you'll all agree, incredible. And we've been given so much to take away and consider tonight. But we're now going to move on to the Q&A session. So just a reminder, if you've got a question for the panel, please feel free to pop that in the chat now. And if you can just preface it with the word question before your text so we can easily identify that from the rest of the chat, that would be wonderful. And if you can also please indicate if you're happy to ask the question yourself, or if you prefer, I can do that on your behalf. And we'll try to get to as many of those questions as we can. And I thought I'd just start us off with a quick question to break us in. And I just open this out to everybody. So I'm thinking about the history of masculinity in horror and the various archetypes and how those archetypes reflect not just horror, but the perception of masculinity on a wider scale. So man as aggressor in horror, possessor, defender, inventor, curer, master, cult leader, monster, serial killer. We could go on. It's been a pretty bleak back catalogue in terms of representation for men in horror. Since the 2000s, we've also seen an influx of films that tackle some really hard-hitting issues that centre around different behaviours. I'm thinking of Midsummer, The Invisible Man, and even most recently, Companion. I wanted to ask the panel about their thoughts on how we strike a balance between exploring all aspects of masculinity without trying to reduce it to simplistic sort of terms, the positive, the negative, whilst making sure that we're given space to tell male stories that reflects, you know, a wide range of experiences. So I'd just open that out for anyone to talk to. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I don't mind starting and chipping in. It's such an interesting question, and as I tend to do, and apologies, I sort of gender flipped it in my head to sort of think, well, how do I feel about sort of the different representations of women as a viewer? And I don't think this is similar for the way the different and sometimes problematic representations of men, but I know for women we sometimes get that sort of, oh, it's camp or it's kitsch, you know, things like Fatal Attraction, or even like The Substance. Some of that stuff was like, oh, this is problematic as heck, but it's also really fun and really silly and bombastic. And I think there is a fine line, and perhaps because so much, as you said, of the problematic masculinity can be traced to very real world epidemics of violence and harassment and gender inequalities, it's so interesting to make it clear in film, not in a overly, we were talking earlier about very unnuanced sort of plots, but not in a very, this is the bad guy, this is the good guy, but actually in terms of who you're experiencing the story through, who you're encouraged to feel empathy for, and having those different masculinities in the same film. And I think that's why some of the ones I mentioned I really liked, because it wasn't just, oh, this is a film about men dealing with grief, or this is a film about men being violent. It was all of it in one, and it could show the many facets of masculinity minute by minute, I suppose, which I think is really important. I don't know if that particularly answered your question, but that just popped in my head. So I'll let my much more learned colleagues take over.
No, that was absolutely fabulous. And just to say that I'm right there with you championing They Look Like People. Yes, so all support for that. So I've got a question here for Kaya. And that is from Summer S. So Kaya, what would you say the best films for Black male representation in a horror are?
Oh, that's a really good question. I'd definitely say I'm gonna say Get Out, because I just think it's incredible in terms of not even just Chris, but Rod, like his friend Rod, and how incredibly intelligent he is, even though at times he is kind of treated like the kind of comedic relief, but he's the one that actually does end up saving Chris, I suppose, at the end. I think I just saw it pop up, Attack the Block with Moses. Again, absolutely fantastic, and especially given the kind of his socioeconomic background and things like that, and how it shows maybe a different side of London and Black masculinity, and how that presents itself in London specifically, is really good. And then I'd say Otis Jr., I believe he's called, in Nope. I think that's a very different representation of Black masculinity, and one that's quite empowering, actually. I'm just going to go through Jordan Peele's filmography at this point. I just think the way he deals with Black male characters is really nuanced, and he's a giant amongst filmmakers because of it. And then, as I mentioned in my last slide, if you haven't seen They Cloned Tyrone, I really recommend watching it. It's fantastic. I don't know if you can call it a horror. This is where the whole genre hybridity comes in. I see it as a horror, but again, I think the way it kind of subverts these archetypes and makes the Black male characters in that quite powerful and intelligent and resourceful, I think is really good. So I hope that somewhat answers the question.
Thanks so much, Kaya. And we have got a question from Vincent Gain, who's going to ask that question himself. So Vincent, if you can just pop your camera and mic on and ask Kaya that question, that would be great.
Hello, testing. Am I coming through?
Perfect. Yep.
Excellent. Hi, everyone. Thanks for some very thought-provoking and intriguing presentations. My question is actually also for Kaya, so sorry to be targeting you. I wondered if you could talk to whether you would, what do you think of the idea of there being connections between the original Haitian mythology of zombies and Get Out? I asked because I did a lecture on this recently, and I just wanted to try it with the experts.
That's really interesting. While, as I'm sure you know, the kind of notion of the zombie in Caribbean cultures is quite prominent, like it's an actual belief. And again, I just find it really interesting, this kind of intersection of when it's predominantly Black countries or characters or whatever it is, with this almost like your body, like you not being in control of your bodily autonomy in a lot of ways. I don't know if I have any thoughts beyond that, because I've not really thought about it in terms of interconnecting it with the Haitian mythology, but there is definitely something there, isn't there, about this kind of lack of ownership and autonomy. And I wonder if it does stem from these kind of Caribbean mythologies, and then it's just becoming reflected in horror. I don't know. I have to think about that some more, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about it if you have any from your lecture.
Well, I won't take up other people's time now, but you and I can talk in another time about it. Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Vincent. So I've got another question here. This one is on behalf of Catherine Pugh. So this is for anyone to pick up, but I have a feeling that, John, this might be your bag, but open to everybody. So Catherine says, vague, I know, but does anyone have comments on final boys / final men? Is there a gender difference in the survivor journey they go on, particularly in the sequels?
Well, I'll jump on there. Just before I start, though, really want to say Ganja and Hess, love that as a Black masculinity text. Make my students watch it every year. They end up despising me for it, but it's criminally underseen and everybody needs to see it. Dwayne Jones as well, for anybody interested. Final boys and final men. See, I don't know, I've got a very strong opinions on Clover and the idea of the final girl, and I tend to use the term survivor because I think it's a bit more accurate, because it takes it away from Clover's and other theorists' ideas of a battle for the visual space of the film, because I think it's a lot more than that. I think it's more about, you know, not just the filmic structures and, you know, the direct environment. It's more about the world itself within these texts. The environment collapses, you know, with each victim that's killed, normality gets stabbed a little bit more, and by the time it's left to the climactic confrontation between the survivor and the killer, they really realize that the world has changed, that they can't go back to the way that they previously were before, you know, Jason Voorhees landed at the campgrounds. And we see this a lot, particularly in the Friday the 13th franchise, because each survivor ends up going insane in one way or another. You know, the survivor of the first film ends up in the hospital, not believed by the enforcers or normality. They're all around her. And she's taken some form of respite in the beginning of the second film, which she's killed off quite quickly. The survivor of that film carted off in a gurney, not being believed by anyone. You know, these people who understand that normality is back, they haven't witnessed normality, you know, being destroyed, being upturned, or, you know, the fact that it never existed in the first place, that it's a hollow facade that we tell ourselves to go to sleep easier at night. And then the third film, she is taken off to an institution. Well, this goes on and on. I can keep listening, but I'd rather not. Again, I feel like the survivors, again, they're the ones that realize that normality does not exist. It's not a real concept. It's actively dangerous. And they believe in normality is to become a victim, essentially, or lead to victimization. So then people start talking about, you know, the final boy, the final man, the absence of masculine survivors. Well, there's quite a few. Like, you've got Tommy Jarvis. He is capable of understanding that normality doesn't exist, and it leads him straight to institutionalization. And it doesn't until the sixth film, where he comes back as a classical hero, and it stops really being a slasher film. It feels more like almost like a Hammer film or a Universal film, but shot in the 80s. But these men have always existed. Lots of men have always existed. I don't really think there's a gender difference. It's just, it almost feels, keep in mind, these films are all shot 70s, 80s, 90s, the ones that I'm talking about in particular. It almost feels like women are more, or it's easier for them to understand that normality is harmful. It's easier to understand that normality can directly attack them and harm them. So we tend to get a lot of men killed off and a few women surviving. But it's interesting how this changes throughout, and I feel like I'm just rambling at this point. If anybody wants to take over and save me.
Just to add to that, I actually think like in contemporary horror film, we're getting a rise of racialized final boys, which I think is quite interesting. Obviously, always going to reference it, Get Out with Chris. In some senses, he does become a final boy or a survivor, John, as you said. But then also, I'm just thinking about a film called Blood Red Sky, if anyone's seen that. And the protagonist, well, he's not a protagonist, he soon becomes a protagonist, and throughout the film, his name's Fahid, he's Muslim. The plane is hijacked by some bad people, and they try to pin it on him because he's Muslim and like an easy scapegoat, unfortunately. But actually, whilst I think audience members are expecting Fahid to die, he outlives everyone. So I think that's quite interesting as well, how, you know, as I say, people that would have historically been quite powerless in the face of persecution are now surviving. So I think that's quite interesting, but that's a penny for my thoughts.
I've got a question here from Yun Chen that I think might be up your street, Andrea, but again, open to everybody, absolutely. How can we view the womb as a site or place of religion, e.g. Rosemary's Baby and Immaculate? Are female victims' discourses about reproductive experiences in horror films being completely denied?
Hi, thanks. Yeah, I will take that one. And first of all, I'm sorry my slides did not show earlier. I had no idea I'd done anything different from when we practiced earlier, but yeah, I will take this, and thank you for the question. I would kind of ask, do we need to see the womb as a site of religion rather than what it is? I can understand there's a desire to do that on a number of fronts, and there is the womb as vassal, woman is sacred, and it feeds into that mother whore religious trope in some respects. I'll sort of pick up slightly on something John was saying there. I also like to use the term survivor more than anything else, because first of all, the world we live in, there's a lot of differences out there that we need to accept and respect. But in terms of the survivor being female, there is some form of reassurance in that there is going to be a continuance of society in some form, that notion of renewing, and that feeds into the question, which is essentially, with every birth, with the reproduction, there is a sense of renewing. And in Americanism, there's a big factor on the family as being the cornerstone of society, and you can't have the family without a means of reproduction, ergo the woman. So I get the sort of religiosity aspect about it, but for me, it's the devaluing of the reproductive system as just the function, and we're seeing that a great deal coming out of America at this moment in time, where you've got senators going on various news channels and they don't say terms like woman or mother, or they're hosts, they're breeders, they're birth givers. So it's a case of, how can we say the womb is a sacred place when it's treated with such disrespect? And in terms of horror, in a lot of respects, it always has been, and that's where some of my research is situated is there is a person there. It's not just a function, but because the horror of watching Rosemary get raped in front of these ritual members, it's digressed away from her experience as a woman being attacked and drugged to what she gives birth to. That's where the horror is relocated. So whether people want to sort of say one's a mirror image of her experience, that's all in the debate.
Thank you so much, Andrea. That was like, I could just listen to you talk and talk. It's just incredible. A question for John then from Laura Me. So John, you briefly discussed slasher killers as blank slates. Does or how does that evolve throughout franchise installments, especially when we get character development for killers, e.g. sympathetic backstories?
Whenever I say blank slate, I'm really talking just from a characterization perspective, you know, their identities, their personalities, because, you know, we don't really get a sense of the interiority of Michael or Jason. They are just forces of nature that come in and turn everything on its head and, you know, torment the survivor and destroy anything that they can. And because of that, a lot of their characterization tends to be assumed because of their costuming, their weaponry, the specific ways to use violence, but we don't actually get a sense of them. The way the characters tend to evolve throughout the franchises, like Jason's a perfect example of this. It's all aesthetic. Like in the first film, he is a child, a helpless child in the lake that is pulling someone else down with him. In the second film, you know, it's Clover had referred to it as the hybridization of the redneck and the Indigenous American. So, you know, you've got this racialized rurality, which isn't part of his character, but is reflected in his aesthetics. And it's not until the third one that you get this idea of recreational violence, until he gets the hockey mask. And then, you know, the working class signifiers of the what is it, the boiler suit. But again, at no point do we actually get a sense of their interiority. The only things that we get are assumptions made by survivors and victims. Like part 2, Jenny tries to get into Jason's mentality, makes a lot of assumptions about him that don't quite work out, results in her boyfriend getting killed and a dog maybe not getting revived. Michael, we're told a lot about him, but again, we don't really understand him. Mostly we're getting told by a doctor that this is the devil. This is black eyes like the devil's eyes. You know, the same thing that was said about a shark a couple of years earlier is now being said about a man that's escaped an institution. And anything beyond that tends to be assumptions or, you know, things about his background, like whenever it becomes all culty or whenever family dynamics are brought into it. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really change his character or anything. It doesn't really give us anything to work with. It's justification rather than personality, identity, or, again, almost signs of humanity. Freddy is the opposite of this, though, because he gets a lot of sympathetic backstory, starting with like one line in the third film and slowly developing into the entire mythos. It's weird because, yes, on one hand, sympathetic, on the other hand, not sympathetic in the slightest. If anybody's seen Freddy's Dead, the Final Nightmare, part 6 of the franchise, he welcomes becoming a demonic figure, puts the hands up and screams, you know, I want power or something like that. It's not quite as He-Man sounding as I've just made it sound, but he says something that welcomes demonic power and that allows him to continue targeting and killing children. So yes, there's sympathy in the fact that he was denied a childhood. He was almost constructed as a monster, but that sympathy tends to get peeled back whenever we realise, he was the Springwood slasher, particularly targeting helpless children whose ages seem to get younger with each installation. The ages of the children before his death, because it seems to be a lot of children. Then after death, it's all teenagers. It's interesting stuff. But even at that, there's a weird thing about Freddy. Again, we don't really get a sense of who he is as a person because he's kind of a clown. He's very performative. He jumps around and shapeshifts. That's another important thing, is a shapeshifter. We don't actually know who Freddy is. He's very performative as a killer. He likes to please himself and make it fun for himself. It's all one big game to him, whereas other people, it's, you know, losing their lives and stuff like that. So we don't really get a sense of who he is. He doesn't have a corporeal form because he's a dream killer. He chooses the form that he uses. You know, that is the most, like Wes Craven had said, that the green and red was chosen because it's the least pleasant combination of colours for the eye. And that's something that Freddy consciously chooses, to look like this. So again, we don't get a sense of who he is, and it's all performative for him. Whereas the other two, it's all just costuming. So even though, yes, they do develop in ways, whether aesthetically or through backstories, they still stay personalityless, if you get what I mean. They just become their cultural context entirely, which I argue is a positive thing. It might sound negative here, but if I can collect my thoughts better, I'll let you know.
That was terrific. And Laura's just commented there that Leatherface is particularly interesting when considering masculinity and franchise development. A lot of very varied representations and presentations of gender which center around the killer.
Leatherface is fascinating because are there even 3 films that connect? You have the original, then its sequel connects to it. The 3rd film only connects to the original. The 4th film only connects to the original. So there's no real development. It's, here's backstory for 1994. Here's the backstory for 2007 or whatever years it is. It all contradicts in a weird way. Like, I know there's one that focused on him and his development in a group home. That's the only one I haven't seen. I've seen the rest of them, so maybe if I had seen one that could answer this more effectively. But again, that's a franchise that I don't think ever really develops. It's always 1 step forward, 2 steps back for the next installment. Quite literally, because they got a prequel at one point, 2 or 3 prequels. But like in the 4th installment, they made Leatherface gender fluid, something that was represented in the masks and the clothing in the first film, you know, going from the apron of the butcher to the apron of the housewife. But then in the 4th film, it seems like a complete transformation from an actual masculine physicality to a drag act at the end, you know, from the feminine personality at the end. The film tries not to address it, but as a viewer, it's hard not to notice. So again, I think there's a lot of implications the audience can make, but I'm not too sure. I have to see the film again to figure out what the film's trying to say about it.
Yeah, this is just fascinating. I'm thinking that one of the sort of central themes that I think that we've seen come up tonight is the theme of identity. And I'm thinking about Kill List, which takes a close look at the trauma of returning from service, military service, contending with financial struggles and PTSD, and how men fit back into the world, into family, and find their place and their identity again. Also, Session 9 was another film that came to mind, which puts a working class group of men at its centre. And I can't not mention Carpenter's The Thing as well, another all-male film which involves, you know, body horror and paranoia. And I really feel like these films are seeking to give context, empathy and understanding actually for their male characters and their individual crises that we might see. I wondered then, with this theme continuing to come up across your presentations this evening, I wondered about just inviting any comments from the panel about why you feel that horror specifically is such a good vehicle for deconstructing masculine identity. So any thoughts on that are truly welcome.
Well, I've always thought that, you know, you can tell the health of a community and a culture by the horror it produces. You know, if you look at fascist cultures, for example, they only really like melodramas and comedies. Horror tends to be cut to death on the editing room, in the editing room. So, you know, the fact that we're producing horror films that can deconstruct and analyze society is a good thing in itself. Shows that even though things are going to shit, at least we have that. At least we can examine ourselves, which is positive. But let somebody else jump on.
Yeah, I was going to say something very similar. Is that it is a mirror. It's almost like a bellwether of what social angst are going on at that particular time. So zombie films kind of fell off the way, and then they started to come back under and around the time when certain social events were taking place. So yeah, they are quite a good bellwether of things that are happening at that point in time, and not so much obviously to reality, although it's sometimes, especially now, it does feel like we are living in the horror film with certain things that are going on. But there's an essence of reality there, that things are not as they would be portrayed in your typical rom-com or something of the like.
Just to add to what John and Andrea have said, to quote Robin Wood in his famous On the Horror Film, I think he says, horror films are our collective anxieties. And like Andrea said, like no matter the decade, horror's always shifted to reflect the anxieties of the time, obviously with like the invasion of the body snatchers and communism, or like second wave feminist issues, and then you get like Rosemary's Baby, The Exorcist, all these things, right? So I think horror, like I'm a little bit of a reflectionist. Like I do think that horror reflects society in very nuanced ways, but then I don't know, like is it a case of it's solely a mirror? Like is it an unconscious thing? Is it something that we're consciously like producing and consuming, or does it just rest in the unconscious? I'm not particularly sure about that, but I think it tells us a lot about who we are in a way, like Andrea said, in a way that say a rom-com or a chick flick or like a noir film doesn't necessarily.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I mean, you've all said it so perfectly, but I think from a kind of individual perspective as well, that there's something about the stealth of horror. I was thinking of The Invisible Man that came out in 2019. Was it Lee Whannell's? Like, I love that film. I think it's great. I think it's exciting. I think it's interesting. But as someone who works with survivors of coercive control, it blew my mind to see that a film that could be so kind of outrageous and strange, and it's about invisibility, but it deals with this really real yet invisible threat that so many people deal with. And I think horror is so skilled at doing that. Even Nightmare on Elm Street 2, I think it is, with Jesse, the male final boy, where it's this idea of like identity. And I know I've read a lot of readings of that film where people conflate it with his sort of sexuality, but there's something about, I think there's a scene where he picks up Freddie's glove and he's sort of towering over his younger sister, and you can just see this fear in his face of, do I have it in me to hurt a child? And even though, again, it's Friday the Nightmare on Elm Street, sorry, it's ridiculous. It's, tongues and madness and stuff, but that really relatable fear is so human. And I feel like horror gets to put that through and make us feel that in snippets, and then pulls back and go, no, don't be silly. It's all about clowns and big arms and flailing things and nonsense. And I think horror is so skilled at that, whereas other films don't have that flexibility to kind of just dabble with something really quite terrifying about ourselves and then pull back and go, no, this is actually about invisibility, don't worry. And I can't mean, I guess sci-fi maybe could, but even then it's sort of often set in this other world, whereas horror is so often, as you were saying, John, it's the reality gone a bit wrong. So I think that is so powerful as a medium to kind of deal with some really awful confronting things, as Andrea was speaking about as well.
Oh, as well, there just it's probably worth noting, Kimmel had, I can't remember which book it is. I'm looking around there nervously, just in case you notice me looking around at the bookcase. There's one there where he charts masculinity and manhood in America over the course of, the duration of the country, 200 odd years. And he mentions that once feminism as, a methodology, a political entity began to exist and began to examine femininity and the dangers the threats against femininity, I should say, and women's role in the world, masculinity got to hide itself. So from a masculine perspective, femininity was placed as an abnormal thing because it needed to be examined. So it could lay unexamined because it didn't talk, if you get what I mean. So then this continues for years, and now we've got to the point where we realize how much of bullshit that is. We've let masculinity kind of fester in the point where femininity could examine itself. Masculinity has festered with its issues, and now we're paying for that with, you know, the rise of the mass terrorist attacks, you know, like the school shootings, the Jeep attacks, and not the van attacks, whatever they are. Horrible cults of misogyny being found in group chats with 200 people on it. And what is it, Andrew Tate's War Room and all that kind of stuff. We festered to the point where horror can't not try and deconstruct this. It really needs to be pushed into the forefront. And it has been. Like, we've got some deconstructions, and I kind of worry that we're moving away from that. We're kind of moving away to a point where masculinity can dip back into its hole and hide and continue to fester, whereas femininity can then be presented as abnormal once again. We're still seeing that. Well, I suppose we haven't stopped seeing that. Fellas on the internet constantly basically making up lies about feminism. People that haven't read a book on it, people haven't had a chance to examine it, have, again, done that. But again, as I was going to say, just to wrap that up pretty much, horror needs to continue looking at masculinity, or maybe, hopefully, we can avoid some of these issues or attempt to resolve them before they worsen, if that's possible.
I think that's a great summation. And may I suggest there be a lot more work for Carl Gallner if he's out there and wanting to take on more roles in horror films. I think those nuanced masculinities are right up his street. So that's awesome. Really interesting. Thanks, John.
Just to jump in with a final wrap up, I want just to add to what John was saying. I think Richard Dyer, I can't remember the quote exactly, but in White, he says, masculinity is like air, like it's all around, so we don't notice it as much, which I think is really, really interesting, because I think especially as we've had the rise of like feminist film theorists, like Clover, Creed, etc., the focus has been femininity, but masculinity is just as important as femininity in a lot of aspects. You know, like men's mental health, the rise of male suicides, you know, male trauma victims and things like that, where it's not discussed as much. And I feel like it's always a discussion of, oh, the violent masculine killer. Well, what happened for him to get there? Like, what can we do as a society? So I think I agree with what John was saying. I think we need to, well, horror films need to continue to evaluate masculinity, as do like we in society with like therapists and dealing with men's trauma and men's mental health. And I think it remains like a very important topic that hopefully more research is done about in the future.
There we go, more research. So sadly, we're about to run out of time, and suddenly an hour and a half does not seem like anywhere near long enough. But before wrapping up this evening's event, I'd like to say a huge thank you to our incredible panelists, Amy, John, Kaya, and Andrea. I hope to be hearing and reading more from all of you in the horror world in the future. Thank you to the team at BAFTSS for hosting this panel and having us. And lastly, thank you to everyone for joining us. We hope that you enjoyed this discussion.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Rebecca, for hosting, and thank you so much to our fantastic panelists. Thank you, everybody. And thank you for coming along this evening, and thank you for your questions as well. If you haven't seen in the chat already, Shelley has just put details of our socials in there. And if you keep an eye on there, there'll be some information about our next event coming out very soon. Our next event takes place in April and is called No Safe Space, Places and Spaces of Horror Cinema. So we'll look forward to that one. But thank you again, everybody, and hopefully see you again soon. Bye-bye.